Annette is probably the other, or she is the other person in the family who was out a lot. And she was out dancing, going to the Café de Flore, going to Beaux-Arts. She was a 19, 20-year-old teenager, a young woman who was in Paris, and she wanted to live in Paris. She wanted to be Parisienne. And so, nothing was going to keep her down, including Nazis.
That was Heather Dune MacAdam, who was talking about Annette Zelman, a 19-year-old Jewish girl in Paris, France during the Nazi occupation. Heather Dune MacAdam and her husband Simon Worrall co-authored Star-Crossed, a true Romeo and Juliet story in Hitler's Paris. The book went on sale August 22nd, just a few short weeks ago, and this is a must-read going back in time in the early 1940s in Paris, France. Heather also wrote 999, The Extraordinary Young Women of the First Official Transport to Auschwitz. And Simon has written 2 books and is a writer for National Geographic magazine. And here's my interview with Heather and Simon about Star-Crossed. Heather and Simon, I am truly honored. Thank you for coming on my podcast to talk about Star-Crossed.
Thanks for having us, Rob.
Yeah, we're happy to be here.
Well, thank you so much. So I have a lot of things to cover, and I know you'll be able to fill in the gaps, but I have read the book, and it really gave me a lot of emotions when I read it. I got angry, and I was elated in other parts of the book. But I think everyone needs to read this to look back at a time how a family did persevere through a horrible time. And first of all, how did you get to the book, to writing it, and how did you research? Because I find that pretty fascinating.
Well, there were 2 strands, really. Memory of Michelle Zelman, who's 95 the other day. We sang her happy birthday. She was the kid sister of Annette Zelman, our hero. When Annette was 18, 19, Michelle was about 8 or 9. We went to Paris. We spent 3 months there, Michelle's beautiful apartment in March, and we sat and we pulled out her memories. And the woman was absolutely amazing, fit as a flea, credible memory. She was great because she wouldn't invent. She would say, I can't remember that, be honest. But she could remember, like yesterday, all the events of that distant time, 1940 to 1945. So all of the recording we did with her and the letters from Annette, the drawings of Annette.
Well, let's pause here.
Family
the archive. So Michelle had inherited an archive of letters and art diary that was her sister's, that no one in the family had seen. That her
for 60 years.
So Michelle had an older brother, and he held that. It was precious to him. Some of the letters were to him personally. And so when he passed away, he left that box to Michelle, and that was only about, 6 or 7 years ago. She'd never seen any of these letters. So that is a big part of our archive. And then, of course, we did field research, and we did archival research in the Paris Libraries, Memorial de la Shoah, the Caen archive, which is the World War II archive in France, that gives you everybody who was deported, everybody who didn't survive, thanks to Serge Clark.
So when you were researching...
And then we probably read about 100 books.
Wow. Well, I read the book, and it was truly a remarkable book. So who were, you mentioned Michelle and you mentioned Annette, who were the Zelmans? Because I found them to be a very close family, but they had a lot going on as a family, and also during the Nazi occupation, but they were a family who were together through a tough time.
Yeah, they're incredibly resilient, and I think the best part about the ZELMAN'S circus, which was how they were known, was that they were smart, but they were autodidactic. They weren't intellectuals. They were not snobs. They were performers. They were fun and pretty crazy, very zany and resourceful.
The father, Moshe, changed his name to Maurice, when he emigrated from Poland to Nancy in eastern France. He was a larger-than-life character, very funny, a great performer. He had a beautiful voice. He was a cantor at the local synagogue, and he did weddings as a singer in Paris. But his primary work was as a tailor. There's a great line from Michel where she said the sound of the treadle on the sewing machine was the soundtrack of our lives and what kept us alive. And she joked as well that he dressed half of Paris, so he could call in favors. He got them through the war. There was always, Michel says, food on the table. He had a car he would drive out, and he would deliver clothes to farmers and farmers' wives and come back with eggs and chicken and bread and vegetables or whatever. And so he was the sort of pivot with Annette, who was 19. She was the other pivot of the family. And the mother, what's her name? Kayla was the opposite. She was the sort of ground to his live wire. And she was a very laid-back woman. Nothing fazed her. And, if he was over-egging it, he'd perform Russian love songs. He'd spent time in St. Petersburg. And after dinner, he'd play on the piano and he'd play these tear-jerking Russian songs. And he'd be tears pouring down his face. And if he was over-egging it, Kayla would say, "Come, Maurice. Thank you, Sarah Bernhardt."
Mm. So when the home that they lived in, that was pretty much their universe. So were they able to manage during their lives and do everyday living with the Nazi occupation in Paris at that time?
Well, it was terribly dangerous to go outside, so you're safer in the house. Maurice was out gallivanting around and wheeling and dealing, which meant often, doing, I think you can hear our ice cream truck maybe going by. Taylor, there's a lovely mention of the Algerian man downstairs who had a fruit stand, vegetable stand, mm-hmm. and he and Maurice obviously were very, very good friends, and Maurice would come upstairs with the chicken, I think he was so affable that people always wanted to help him, and then he could always dress you. So that was a huge part of it. Annette is probably she is the other person in the family who was out a lot. Mm-hmm. And she was out dancing, going to the Café de Flore, going to Beaux-Arts. She was a 19, 20-year-old teenager, a young woman who was in Paris, and she wanted to live in Paris. She wanted to be Parisienne. And so, nothing was going to keep her down, including Nazis.
So Annette, that home that they lived in, the ZELMAN'S, I was reading, when I read the book, she slept underneath the dining room table because she used to do her artwork on the dining room table because she was an artist. And can you explain that? Because that was pretty much was she like the life of the family, because everybody seemed to congregate at the dining room table?
Yeah, she was the sort of second pole of the family with Maurice. She was the second decision maker because Kayla, the mother, was so laid back. And she was the babysitter for the kids. And as Michel said, she always had an idea how to entertain the kids. Let's do this. Let's do that. Let's make paper hats, etc. And in the meantime, she was, at the dining table after dinner doing her artwork.
But I will say, and I have a very, very dear friend who has a Russian family. They had a huge Victorian home. There was no living room. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you wanted to congregate, you went to the table.
Around the dining table.
The Russian, that is a very Eastern European experience. The dining room table is where everybody lives, moves, and breathes. And that certainly because she slept underneath it.
I thought that was fascinating because she was definitely very young, 19. And she was out and about as going to hanging out with people her age. When you saw the archives of the letters and things of that nature, did you feel like Annette came alive when you were getting this information? Because of how she lived? Because I find that fascinating because everything was in this archive. What was it like when you were actually going through the archive?
Well, it was extraordinary. At first, I will say that it's all in French, and she has a very ornate scrawl. And her great nephew, Gregory, typed all of the letters for us. And there was many times when I couldn't understand what she had written, and Gregory really got to know her script. So it was once he had translated everything, or he had transcribed everything, then we had to translate it. And that, what was so interesting is that you have to remember, she was writing letters to her brother in prison and also writing letters to her lover when she was in prison. So all of these letters have codes in them. Anytime you're writing to and from prison, especially, with Nazis around, you had to send messages in code. And a lot of the code for her brother was humor. It was puns. It was cultural references that we needed help unpacking. And we had a wonderful historian work with us. And that was when I had a feeling, because I worked a lot with the letters, and I had a feeling like I knew her. And then there would be a paragraph. I'd be like, what is going on here? And I would send it to this man in France, and he would come back and he's like, oh, that was a film that came out in 1938. And that's a reference to, and you just realize that her letters, especially to her brother, are just full of jokes. And some of them are going to be very personal that we will never know what she was saying, but they were to entertain him, enlighten him, and encourage him while he was in prison. And so I got a real sense of who she was, which is a very funny, witty, smart young woman.
They're marvelous letters. They're funny, they're sassy, they're witty. She has so many great put-down lines.
Oh, my God.
Sometimes of her love rival, Bella Lempert. She describes her as with rancid armpits and smelling of cheap cologne. And she's just, that's how you're in her head. You're reading these
really
letters,
in her head.
Whether it's complaining about babysitting the kids or the beginnings of her love for Jean. You're just in her mind.
So she became attracted to Jean Gérion, a Catholic poet, and they were attracted to each other. But at that time, it was not seen as getting the approval of each of their parents, but somehow they persevered through this tough time in their lives with Nazi occupation and also the tensions of their families. Yes. They seem to have, can you explain the Annette and Jean, how they met and how their relationship transpired? Yeah,
well, they met at the Café de Flore. She'd actually gone through a couple of other guys in their set previous to Jean, so you could say he was the sort of third choice. But that's a bit unfair.
I remember that. Yes,
she genuinely did fall in love with him. Her first amour at the Café de Flore was Jean Rouch, who was a sort of alpha male of the setup, Sorbonne student, anthropologist, later a famous filmmaker. She was very attracted to him, but it was a sort of stop-start relationship. He wanted more in terms of the bed than she was prepared to offer. And she sort of tortured him. She called him her flea in her glass cage. And finally, she turned her attentions to Jean, who was a very well-known young poet, Dadaist, surrealist poet. He had a magazine, a cultural magazine in the 30s called Les Réverbères, which is the street lamps. So they published original art, poetry, prose, short stories, and they did crazy events, a bit like the happenings in San Francisco in the 60s, where they had jazz and plays and and he was a very dapper young man. He dressed always in a finely tailored suit with a silk handkerchief in his breast pocket, and but he was an artist through and through. And he came from a very bourgeois family. His father was a well-known doctor of diseases of the skin called Herbert Jausion, who was also a pro-Vichy, semi-Nazi, and right-wing Catholic. He was a collaborator in the sense that he knew lots of collaborators, like Jean Cocteau, the playwright and poet. And so they met and they start to date, and they go out and they get serious, and there's tension, hence the Romeo and Juliet tag in the title. So from the Jewish side, yeah, well, he's a goy, that's not great, but they were mostly concerned that she was too young to get serious about a boy, and the fact that he was goy, well, that's even worse. But it wasn't kind of like, they came to accept him eventually, became part of the family. But on the other side, the Jausion family, they absolutely were rabid anti-Semites, and they hated the idea that their beloved only child, Jean, was dating a Jewess, and God forbid could marry him and have Jewish spawn.
Wow. While I was reading the book.
He does put it straightforward there.
Yeah, that was, when I was reading the book, I found it fascinating. Even during the Nazi occupation, the family, the ZELMAN'S, and even Jean and the other circle they seemed to be fighters, and they kind of, even through the occupation, they had to look over their shoulder. They were fighters, and they were resilient, and they found ways to survive and do things, help their neighbors, or barter, or do things to survive. People would trade things. Did you find that fascinating during this, that they, throughout all the occupation of Paris, that they were able to help each other out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were born survivors. Maurice always pulled the rabbit out of the hat during the war and after the war. I don't know whether he had a whole bag full of gold ducats under the floorboards, but he always had money for an emergency. And yeah, they pulled through, and they had their own world. Of course, that was, out in the street, it was grim and dangerous, but in the four walls of the Zelman apartment, it was the circus. It was fun. It was funny. It was musical. It was crazy. And they lived their life like that. But of course, it got steadily worse all through 41, anti-Jewish edicts. Gradually, the noose tightened on Jewish people in Paris under the villain of our book, Theodor Dannecker, the head of the Nazi SS, who was a horrible piece of work, out-and-out Nazi and anti-Semite, organized the transports of French Jews out of Paris. And there's a chilling moment, which is then a comedic moment, typically with the Zelmans, where Maurice and Charles are out of the house, and I think Annette's out, and there's a big bang, bang, bang on the door. And Kyla knows instinctively that's not a friend, that's not a neighbor. Nobody knocks, they just walk in. She opens the door, and there's two big French gendarmes, and they say, we're looking for Maurice Zelman. Where is he? Is he here? And quick as a flash, Kyla ad-libs, she says, that bastard Maurice, he went off with some French whore 2 weeks ago. I haven't seen him since. And if you catch him, give him a big fat knuckle sandwich in the face.
Wow.
But Maurice returned, she told him, and he was on the next train out to the free zone, to Limoges.
You mentioned knocking on the door. I remember one when I was reading the book that you could tell by the knock of the door whether it was a friend or a foe, and that must have been gripping and horrible, not knowing what was on the other side of that door, because there were days, I think, would you think that there were days where it was not totally being besieged with the Nazis, or was it just always looking over your shoulder?
Yeah, for the men particularly.
At this point, definitely.
And then, of course, there's another even more fateful knock on the door when Annette's parents and the rest of the family, they hightail it out of Paris as things heat up, and they go to Limoges in the free zone, which is a Jewish-friendly city in central France. She says, I'll join you in a week. I've just got to tidy up some loose ends here. Of course, she has no intention of going. She immediately moves into John's studio apartment, which becomes their love nest. And then she's home alone, and there's a big knock on the door. and Heather will take it up from there.
Well, I don't need to take it up there because we know where it's going. But you know, I will say, anytime, and as Simon said, anytime there was a knock on the door, it wasn't a friend.
It's just it's unbelievable. Just the horror that they had to deal with. So Annette ended up being transported after that knock on the door.
Well, yeah, I mean, so to back up there, Annette and Jean-Josien move in together, and probably we're surmising this as a way to protect her, because at this point they've moved from male roundup to female roundup, and as a way to protect her, I think they probably thought, let's get married. They wanted to get married anyway, but to change the Zelman name to Josien, because Jean's father was quite important. And unfortunately, the moment they published their marriage ban, within 24 hours, there was the knock on the door.
They were denounced.
And she was arrested, and 24 hours later from that, Dannecker, who's head of the SS in Paris, passes a law making it illegal for a Jew to marry a Gentile. And she becomes a political prisoner. And that seals her fate.
I always, when I was reading the book, I was always hoping that they would meet, and I was waiting for that time where they would unite. And
we know the end of the story, and in the research of it, we feel the same way, exactly. I mean, I can't tell you how many, this is my third Holocaust book, and I'm always wishing I could change the ending. Novelists can do that. It's really easy. And that's probably why a lot of people enjoy reading Holocaust novels, because they're easygoing. You can fictionalize the story, but in our story, you have to tell the truth. Mm-hmm. And the truth is not pretty.
It's not. And I found myself, when I was reading the book, I was getting angry. I mean, I was I can't believe, how could they treat people like this? This was just, it was horrible. It was just, I couldn't fathom it. And there were times I was just getting angry while I was reading it. I said, I can't believe this. It's just horrible. Jean was a very brave person as well. He was on top of being a poet, did he not join the resistance as well during the World War II in Paris or in France?
Yeah, he did. He, after Annette disappeared, he's stuck in limbo, miserable, sad and depressed. He goes back to the Café de Flore with his friends still, and Simone de Beauvoir writes a beautiful little paragraph about the empty seat.
Yes.
That beautiful Czech girl, as she called Annette, though she was Polish, and Jean are no longer there, and the empty seat is a symbol for all those others who've disappeared. And he writes a novel. He visits her parents in Limoges. He becomes part of their family. And then as liberation of Paris begins, he joins the fight on the barricades, the erected barricades all over the
It's like Les Miserables.
Yeah, exactly, like furniture and carts, and he was on those barricades. He actually got arrested, and I've never been able to find the context, but he was released, and I guess his father intervened somehow. And then, he sets off to find Annette.
Mm. When you were doing your research and you were in France, did you go to places in France where maybe Annette went or Jean went or the ZELMA'N'S were? Because I find that you probably feel their presence when you were there. Did you ever get to any of those places where they lived?
I followed them.
Yeah, I will say, because of Simon's background as a National Geographic writer, field work is super important with NG, and he is great to travel with and to do field research with. So we did all of it. We wrote in the Café de Flore. We actually went to the Café de Flore with Michel. She showed us where Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul sat. She showed us where Annette and Jean sat. We had a couple of great moments. Like we went to Boulevard de Strasbourg, where the Zelmans lived in Paris, and the door was locked, of course. There was no concierge, and somebody came out, and I did my little New York City number. I stuck my heel in the door as the door was closing, and I held it open for Michelle, and she was delighted. So we went into the building where, the Zelman Circus lived, and we went up those marble stairs, which were worn in the middle, and you could just see the kids racing up and down those stairs in their roller skates. And we knocked on the door of the apartment. It was COVID, totally understandable that the woman didn't let us in. But, in the middle of the night, one night, we decided to get in the car. We had a car, and we took the route from Boulevard Strasbourg to the Citadel in the middle of the night, so we could see the route that Annette probably took, was taken in the paddy wagon by the police when she was arrested, and then we walked around the Citadel and the Palais de Justice, which was extraordinary.
Enormous, 3 blocks of city blocks, huge, like a giant fortress there, and that's where they had a jail. It's the nerve center of French justice then and now. There's a famous scene in Les Miserables where, what's the policeman's name? Yeah, whatever. He looks across it and he talks about the tenements of darkness. And in the Palais de Justice, there's a horrific prison in the basement called the Depot, where they held, it was like a holding cells.
And it's for before you go to trial. But what was happening is there were so many people being arrested, so many Jews being arrested, that the Depot was now more than just a holding before you go to court. It was, they were there for weeks. And it was very, very, very tough. Very, you had no contact with the outside. You could get letters, but Annette couldn't even meet with her lawyer. Everything had to be letters.
Let me go back to Michelle. What was it like when you were, had talked earlier about talking to Michelle? Did you see a little bit of Annette in her when you were talking with Michelle? Because you said she just celebrated her 95th birthday. That must have been pretty unbelievable to meet Annette's sister.
Mm-hmm.
She's wonderful.
Same sense of humor.
Yeah, very, very sharp. I think Annette was more of a rebel.
And more of an artistic.
And more artistic. Michelle is has a traditional family setting, and but they are, all of the Zelman children are very smart. No nonsense. And Michelle, and I know her daughter very well, who's one of my best friends. Absolutely. There's always a twinkle in their eye. And we were actually visiting them at Christmas last year in Paris. We went to see Michelle and her daughter. She has identical twin daughters, and they stood up with their husbands and started dancing for their mother, and it was just adorable. I just looked at Simon and I was like, "Oh my God, it's the Zelman Circus!" They're like, "Mama," and they're doing, I don't know if it was salsa or swing. I think they were doing swing. They were taking swing classes. It's a fabulous family. We just adore them. They've been part of our lives for decades, or part of my life for decades.
And Annette, she was like part of the hip crowd. She was part of the hip crowd back at that time. From what I read in the book, she was very popular. She was with the popular group, but it was quite something. When I look back at towards the end, there was like the liberation of France. That was, for all the tragedy, it was really uplifting to see that France was able to be liberated by the Allies and the U.S. troops. What was your sense when you were researching? How did you feel about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a joyous moment when liberation finally comes. There have been rumors for months that the war might end and the Allies were getting closer, but it finally came. And of course, there's that huge victory parade. De Gaulle arrives from England and walks into the Place de la Concorde, I think it is, and gives a speech. And the crowds are delirious, and the Americans are all there.
Tell them about because we traveled down the.
Yeah, and then of course, Jean, who's been waiting in Paris, in limbo. The minute that Patton comes through Paris, he gets in a car, old Citroën, like Maigret, the detective, with 3 journalists. He gets a gig with a resistance newspaper called Franc Tireur, and he traveled literally in the wake of Patton's army east towards Germany, Poland. He doesn't know where, but he's going to look for Annette. And we followed that route. You can get a guide to it, actually. It's called the Voie de la Liberté, Liberty Road. And there are marker posts and information at all the towns that it goes through. And we followed that. We followed him until we got to a little village called Gravelotte, where the last sighting of Jean takes place. And there's a farm there called Mogador, or just on the left as you go down into Gravelotte. And that became semi-well known because it was where Patton holed up for 2 weeks when his tanks ran out of gas. There's a famous quote from General Patton where he said, "My men can eat their boots, but my tanks need gasoline." And he was stuck there at this farmhouse for 2 weeks. And we came and we looked at it and knocked on the door. An old French peasant woman answers the door, and she doesn't know anything about Jean, but she knows all about Patton and that he stayed there. And she points to the farmyard. And there we discover these huge, great American Army, U.S. Army artillery shells, a trenching spade, and an American water canteen.
Incredible. Prior to us getting on this episode here, I did look at some liberation of Paris after World War II on YouTube, and there were thousands, if not millions, of Parisians lining the streets with the American and Allied troops and the American flags. That just looked unbelievable. I mean, that is just it gave me goosebumps when I saw that. It's incredible. Like, they were finally free, and they had to really, like, they had not pinched themselves, but they were putting up peace signs and things of that nature. I find that the Allied forces.
I just like to hit here because it is one of my beefs with Holocaust deniers, that the people who deny the Holocaust forget what our American troops and what they witnessed,
of course,
what they saw, and what they sacrificed in order for the liberation of Paris. And anybody who denies the Holocaust denies those sacrifices. And I just think it's so important that we remember that, this was a huge, I don't know a single veteran from World War II who denies the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, for anybody to deny the Holocaust is repulsive, repugnant. I did see on the video there, the German troops, they were being things thrown at them and being yelled at by the Parisians, and they were running with their hands up. So that was quite nice to see as well, if I don't mind saying that.
Yeah.
This book was tremendous. It was a look back at a family that fought through the Nazi occupation. What are some things that you learned about it, about the ZELMA'N'S, that maybe you find my audience would find it rather fascinating?
I think one of the things that I love most about the ZELMA'N circus is the closeness of the family, and it is the true family unit, and how they're creative and energetic, and they don't always agree, but they always love each other. And one of my favorite scenes is, when Annette is just tortured in love with Jean Josien, and her father is, she's crying and weeping, and he holds her and weeps with her. He doesn't even know what's wrong. He's just, and then when he finds out what's wrong and that she's fallen in love with this Gentile, he's like, ah! And he's, they're screaming and yelling at each other. And then they fall into each other's arms and weep and hug each other. And he accepts Jean. And, that is family. You may not always like what your kids do or your siblings do, but you love them. And I think, that's how they survived. And the loss of Annette was a huge hole in their lives. And I don't know that anybody ever recovers a loss like that. For me, finding, the archive that I did that reports Annette's presence in Auschwitz. So we have, we sat down with Michel and we read it together. The last known words of Annette, that is in one sense a way of closure and giving peace. But she left a hole in all of their lives. And even her grandsons say to us, you guys know our great aunt better than we do. She's left a hole in my life because I never got to meet her. I mean, I love her. I just love her.
I think your listeners will fall in love with the family as we did and with Annette. And I think it's a great advertisement, if you like, for an open, free, liberal upbringing. The parents were very hands-off. They let those kids basically become the people they wanted to become. And they didn't intervene and they disciplined them. And it was an open, fun, democratic kind of upbringing.
C'est vrai.
Well, I've also found that, even though that the ZELMA'N'S did not approve of Jean, but what I really found fascinating was that
only very much at the beginning.
At the beginning, right.
They eventually adopted him and he became their son.
Absolutely. That was,
they loved
that. I found that to be, they knew that he had Annette's back, and I think that was tremendous through all they've been through. I thought that was remarkable. So, Heather and Simon, I want to thank you so much for joining my podcast, HODGEPOD. It's been truly an honor that you would come on, and I really appreciate you sharing your research and writing this book, Star-Crossed, a tremendous look back at a family and Annette Zelman. It's truly remarkable. So thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
Thank you so much,
Thanks, Rob. It's a real pleasure.
Star-Crossed, it is an amazing book. I could not put it down once I started reading it. For some of my New York listeners, Heather and Simon will be at the Floyd Memorial Library in Greenport, New York, September 17th from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. to discuss Star-Crossed. In addition, on September 21st, Heather and Simon will be at the Barnes & Noble bookstore in Staten Island Mall from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Again, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.